Let me please start by just introducing our panelists. I'm going to start with Kashif over here on my left. Kashif is a program officer in the Communities Program at the McCormick Foundation in Chicago, where he works with some of the nation's most respected nonprofit organizations and in their corporate social responsibility program. In 2011, he helped co-found the Pillars Fund, a partnership with Chicago Community Trust and a handful of Chicago's most influential American Muslim leaders. The Pillars Fund has granted more than $1 million since its inception and has been nationally recognized as a unique and innovative model for American Muslim philanthropy. Thank you, Kashif.
Thank you.
And Ade Faseha joins us from Unbound Philanthropy, where she joined in May of 2012 as a program officer. Ade helps to develop, implement, and evaluate Unbound Philanthropy's grant-making strategies in the United States. She previously worked for 10 years at the National Immigration Law Center, most recently serving as policy attorney and campaign coordinator. She worked tirelessly on a wide range of federal policy issues at NILC, including notably as lead lawyer on a national advocacy campaign to pass the DREAM Act. So thank you, Ade. So before I start, this is a panel on philanthropy. Can I just ask how many funders we have in the room today? Okay, I see a handful of hands go up, which is great. We need more, and that's part of what this panel will discuss. So Ade, let me start with you. I'm going to use a quote to start. Okay? It has been said that art is not a mirror to hold up to society, but a hammer with which to shape it. So I'd like you to just reflect on that, and whether you think art is a reflection or more actively helps to transform society. Can you please share with us why Unbound Philanthropy has a dedicated arts and culture program?
So thank you for hosting this. And I think we definitely see arts and culture as a powerful tool in changing the master narrative, as has been said. And in particular, I think we are interested, we have more deeply focused in pop culture in particular. I think we have a lot to learn from the LGBTQ movement that has really used arts and culture in funding in that space, really thoughtfully looking at people, where people are watching, to effectively change the narrative. And you really see a policy change. I think there is, among social justice funders, an emphasis on funding traditional civil rights organizations, funding policy advocacy, and I think there's a space for that. I think arts and culture allows us to have a different conversation. Mm-hmm. And comedy in particular, I think, allows us to have difficult conversation in a safe space, and I think that's really the reason why we're emphasizing not only arts and culture, but pop culture in particular. And the last thing I'll say is it also, I think it's important to diversify who we see. I think there's a benefit in just diversifying who's on TV, who's in movies, but it's also important in thinking about who's behind the camera, mm-hmm. who's telling the story, and from what perspective. I think you can dramatically shift the capacity of people to effectively tell their own story, and I think integrating multiple voices is a part of what's driving mm-hmm. kind of our funding in that area.
I know it's such a rich area of your funding, and Unbound has had great influence on other funders in really thinking about how to enter this space, even if they're driven by particular issues or trying to advance social change. Can you give us an example of a creative project that really comes to the fore when you think about working with artists to advance social change? Yes, of course, this one.
I think for us, so Unbound Philanthropy has been kind of a staff grant-making foundation since 2008, and our early investments really were in engaging the immigrants' rights movement in particular in using arts and culture as a strategy, along with policy advocacy and litigation, to really advance immigrants' rights and the way in which we talk about immigrants. The conversation around immigration had gotten, as you well know, really vitriolic. It was a lot of really kind of base stereotypes that people were using and repeating over and over, and it was spilling into that kind of policy advocacy. And I think we funded arts and culture as a way to kind of neutralize it, to have a new language to talk about it, but to also develop images. So the example I think that comes to mind is Fabiana Rodriguez, who is kind of a leader in this space, and it is a new and emergent space. That the cross between social justice and arts and culture, kind of where that intersects, is a new and kind of growing space, and she's been a real leader in bringing us along, and a lot of other, I think, funders and advocates. And the meme she helped create around the monarch butterfly, the image of kind of the monarch butterfly on a yellow background. And it is a kind of very visual representation of immigration. The monarch butterfly kind of migrates through Mexico in that southern border corridor, and it's seen as something that's beautiful. And in the same way, she wants us to reimagine immigration as something that's beautiful, that's natural, that happens, kind of in our natural environment, that also happens among people. And so that kind of visual expression, and it really became kind of this emblematic visual that you saw in marches, that you saw as the backdrop on T-shirts when people were doing presentations. And so it had, I think we had initially funded her to think about how you shift the narrative, and it had a slightly different but altogether other important result, which is to galvanize a movement. It had a way of allowing people to identify around an image and talk about it in kind of a really different way. And so that's kind of what comes to mind. And can I say one last thing? Yeah. It also, I think, arts and culture has the power to take us out of our silos. I fund in immigration and migration. Eric and I partnered on this. He funds racial justice. And I think a lot of the communities, a lot of the issues that we all work on, that we all care about, partly through funding structures, partly through the way we organize around these issues, have a tendency to be kind of really siloed and in their own individual capacity. But if you really think about it, they are so interrelated, and arts and culture allows us to kind of approach these as a spectrum. We can all work together to change the narrative around the things we care about, which impact our communities in really different ways. So it does take us out of our silos. It allows us to work together kind of more holistically.
Yeah, thank you. That's a beautiful example. So Kashif, can you take us behind the scenes at the Pillars Fund and help us understand what was the conversation like when this project was presented to you all? It's not your standard grant proposal, right?
No, it's not at all, actually. This is, and so sort of unlike Unbound Philanthropy, arts and culture is actually a pretty new world to me. I mean, my background has always come in social services, so at the McCormick Foundation, the work that I do is mostly around education, workforce development, housing programs. And so actually, in fact, within the McCormick Foundation, the program that I specifically work for, we don't fund arts and culture. And so part of to get to your question, to really be able to understand what that conversation looked like, you have to understand why and how Pillars was formed, 4 or 5 years ago. And really the reason it was formed was because we were starting to see this really angry dialogue when it came to Muslims, American Muslims in this country. And it was something that I experienced. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and was one of very few Muslims in my high school and my community. And what we were seeing after 9/11 was more and more people having this incredibly sort of skeptical attitude towards people that simply identified as Muslims. And so when I moved to Chicago for my career after college, and I was starting to work in the field, I really started to think, there are no funders that are focusing specifically on American Muslim nonprofits and or programs or agencies, things like that. And it was starting to it was starting to becoming a bigger issue, because as I was working with nonprofits around the country, they kept saying, we have no access to funding, and here I was, before I was at the McCormick Foundation, I was at the United Way of Chicago working for these large funders, yet not being able to really, because to be honest, these programs wouldn't have been able to really come through those means, through McCormick, through the United Way. And so, a few years ago, we put together, and it was a sort of an involved process involving a number of people, so I certainly don't want to take the credit for doing it myself. But we founded the Pillars Fund, and since its inception, we've funded mostly sort of the social services programs, because that's, again, my bias is because that's where my background comes from. But second, it's sort of what is predominantly out there when it comes to some of these issues. And so when this project came to me, it was something that I got incredibly excited about, because I really thought that we could have, we talk about impact in philanthropy all the time. We talk about outcomes, we talk about benchmarking, we talk about all these issues. And I think one of the things that these programs like this or projects like this can sort of unfortunately suffer from is this, they sort of get labeled from other funders as unable to be sort of what's the outcome, how can you measure it, how can you track it? And when this project came, I was immediately enamored by it, because I thought this could really, really change, it has the opportunity to change the dialogue in a really interesting and funny way. As fans of The Daily Show can attest to, the way that Jon Stewart has been able to take stories and make fun of them have really made us think, and really made us think, like, why do we hold these attitudes? And so when this project came, I thought, we should definitely try to see what we can do. And the conversation amongst the board was so fascinating, because what I found was that we were holding a project like this to standards that we wouldn't hold other grantees to. And I found that to be so fascinating. There was really, we probably had more debate about this project than any other grantee that we've had over the last 4 years. It was a healthy debate, and ultimately we came to the conclusion that we should absolutely support it. But really what I was finding is that the people that really supported it, it was for the reason that if this thing can take off, we have the ability to really be able to help it shift attitudes, cultural attitudes. And we really want to be able to have the flexibility. One of the great things about Pillars is that we're not bound by sort of traditional philanthropic sort of standards, where we can take these types of risks, where we can say, this is not a project that perhaps McCormick would fund, and that's okay. This is a project that we should really be able to throw some money towards and see what we can do with it. Yeah. And it was an absolutely thrilling conversation, and I was so excited that we were able to come forward.
So it gave you some good training. I mean, you are also in the world of philanthropy. What do you say to funders that don't have, kind of a dedicated arts and culture program, or even those that do, but don't take the types of risks, that are associated with supporting satire? How do you, but we know that these can have, like you said, some of the biggest impacts on changing cultural attitudes. What do you say to them about supporting cultural strategies?
Well, I would say that, because as many of us who are in the field, as I was mentioning earlier, we're and rightfully so, we're so obsessed with this idea around outcomes. We're so obsessed with this idea around, what are, how many, when it comes to the social services, it's like how many students are being affected, how many are graduating, how many are going towards post-secondary. And I would say that, to the funders that don't necessarily fund in this area, is that you can actually, there are ways to be able to look at programs like this and actually be able to gauge the impact. And I think that we just need to be able to think a little bit outside of those sort of rigid structures that we're normally accustomed to. And so, I would say that, far be it from me, because, I would go to McCormick and say we should fund this, and I completely respect the fact that we have a very specific focus, and it's not that we don't fund in arts and culture because we think that there's anything wrong with it, but because of our dedicated focus. What I would say is that really, to funders, think about what it is you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to accomplish, for example, kids graduating and then moving towards post-secondary opportunities, are there media strategies that we can employ that can actually move the needle on that issue? And if so, let's think through that. So that's what I would really encourage funders to think about.
Great, thanks. So we're close to finishing. Can I ask you guys one last question for both of you? And that is, you know, we're about to see a couple of webisodes, but before that, what are you thinking? You've had a chance to kind of be part of this project for a while. What are you hoping that people in this room walk away with today?
I can start.
Yes.
I hope that it starts a conversation. That's really kind of the beginning point. I think there are complicated issues that I think we have, as a country, avoided for a long period of time. So a lot of, I think even for funders, I think some of the concern around projects like this comes from the unknown. And I think that's what this addresses. It allows you to talk about the unknown, to ask questions, to start conversation in your community. So what I hope that people walk away with is beginning the conversation and then engaging. Send it out, you know, tweet about it, put it on Facebook, whatever. I'm pretty sure I'm out of date on all of the new mediums by which people spread this information.
You mentioned Instagram.
Instagram.
Yeah.
So I do hope people engage in the conversation within their communities, within their families, their schools, but also engage a wider group of people.
Thanks.
Yeah, so obviously all of that, but what I really hope and is that, you know, as you watch this and we start to think about, you know, sort of any of our own inherent biases and start to think about sort of how those play out and honestly to think about, you know, and I think what the show does a really good job of is showing how almost ridiculous some of these fears are. And that's what I'm really hoping that, you know, as we watch this and we start to really think about societal attitudes towards groups that, you know, sort of the other, and start to really, you know, break it down and think, you know, like, you know, why is it that we are fearful of you know, certain groups of people and, you know, so I hope that's something that people really walk away with, you know, because I know I certainly did.
Great. Well, thank you so much for supporting this project, for joining us and supporting it, and for being with us tonight. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.